Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another big Survivor ranking. One that I really don't know why I'm doing this. This is such a random group of people to be ranking here, but I'm going to be doing my second boot ranking. Where again, I've done pretty much every other major ranking based on placement, so I guess we're now doing second boots. Sort of like all those other lists that I've done, this will be an assessment of these players on these specific seasons, not how they are as players in the grand scheme of things. Also, there's a lot of weird circumstances around second boots. So I guess here I will define who I am considering for this list. So obviously, this is a second boot ranking, meaning that this is going to be a ranking of people that were voted out second from the game. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that these people were the second eliminated from their seasons, as in cases of medevacs or most quits, again, I will be skipping over those, especially again, if they did not happen at Tribal. So for people like a Mike Barassi and Samoa, again, I will be including Betsy instead of him. For Dave vs. Goliath, again, because Pat Cusick was medevaced as the first boot, again, I will be skipping over to Jeremy for this second boot ranking. Jackson's ejection from 42 means I skip over Zach and put on Mariah on this list. Bruce's medevac in 44 means, again, I skip over Maddie and put on Helen. However, one specific spot here that I will not be skipping over somebody is Hannah Rose in 45. I do feel like Hannah, for me, is someone that I do still classify as a first boot. I do think she's someone that, again, went to Tribal, begged everyone to vote her out. The entire tribe agreed to vote her out, only for them to not go through the formal voting process. Again, I still consider her a first boot, as again, the entire round of gameplay culminated in her being eliminated at Tribal, to where, again, I still would consider her first boot. So again, someone like Brandon Donlin is still on this list. Now, beyond that, gotta mention for situations like Redemption Island or Edge of Extinction, I will be including the second person formerly voted out of those seasons. So again, while Russell Hantz and Papa Bear were technically the second eliminated from their respective seasons, I will instead be including Matt Elrod and Christine for this list instead. Now, Blood vs. Water is also a very weird circumstance, considering obviously you have the two people voted out at the very beginning of the game. On day one, I will not be including those in the overall process, so through that, Rachel is the second boot, and to be fair, she's the second eliminated also, so again, it kind of works out that way. And again, when it comes to Edge of Extinction, again, obviously, the second people voted out of those seasons are Keith and Amber. I will not be including the Edge of Extinction quits into this, so again, they will be on this list here. Pertaining to Survivor Palau, we obviously have the Jonathan Wanda situation, and in this video, like my first boot ranking, I'll be just skipping right over them and talking about Ashley Ashby as the second boot in this spot. Now, the final kind of weird circumstance I'm going to be talking about here is pertaining to Survivor 41, where obviously we did get a double boot in the premiere episode. And through that, I included both Abraham and Sarah in my first boot ranking, and through that, I will be including Voce on this ranking as the second boot, even though, again, he's technically the third. But again, he gets voted out in the second boot slot. So with that, again, those are all the weird circumstances. Let's get into the ranking itself. We have 47 players to be ranking here, and this will be ranking on how they played on their respective seasons. And at number 47, the worst second boot of all time to me is Jacob Derwin from Ghost Island. And it was close. I do think it's close between Jacob Derwin and the next person we'll be talking about. Where I do think Jacob is someone that just plays it kind of all wrong. And the thing is, he's not necessarily a player void of pros. I do feel like there are people that, again, he was trying to work with. I think people in ideal situations would have been willing to keep him around, but those people just didn't really have influence. People like a James, people like a Laurel, people like a Donathan. Or again, if they were able to keep him around as a number, I feel like they would be fine doing that. But obviously, again, he did not cultivate any real relationships. He also came off very schemy throughout the season. Again, him openly bragging about how he tricked the other tribe into picking him for Ghost Island is definitely a major negative there. And really also a major reason why he's on the bottom here is because he should have been the first boot. Where again, had he not been picked for Ghost Island, he's probably the first boot of the season. Where again, he was given immunity through that. And had that not been the case, again, it seemed like his tribe was very willing to vote him out. I mean, they literally voted him out the next time he's at Tribal. So again, for a second boot of the season, he's one that, again, should have been a first boot. And even in his spot as a second boot, he plays pretty terribly. Where he's just so expendable to the rest of the tribe. Doesn't really cultivate any true strong relationships. Even the one that he thought he built with Stephanie Johnson was not really real from her end. Where, again, I just think Jacob is a player that does most things wrong on this season. That's why he's here number 47. Number 46, similar thing. I think these are very similar. First boots that, again, it had some people that would have been willing to keep them around, but again, had the majority tribe against them. Was not particularly trusted within their tribe, and were just social outcasts the entire time. And that player here is Billy Garcia from Survivor Cook Islands. And again, Billy Garcia, I've said in the past, I think is one of the worst players of all time. I do think he's a player that annoyed his tribe so much to the point where they threw the second immunity challenge of the season in a spot where they were a tribe of 5. To where, again, I think when you process that idea, it is pretty insane how much the likes of JP and Ozzy really just hated Billy and went so far out of their way to get him voted out here. Now, with that said, again, in comparison to Jacob Derwin, I think there are some pros here, particularly in the fact that, again, he was not going to be the first boot. Now, technically, he's, again, still the first voted out of his tribe. If his tribe had lost the first challenge, he would have been voted out. But again, Jacob Derwin, again, was actually going to be the first boot had the Ghost Island twist not given him immunity. Where, again, I think that's at least, again, a more wonky circumstance there for Jacob Derwin. Also, Billy Garcia, I think his connection to Christina was a lot more real than that of Jacob's to really just anyone else on his tribe. So again, I think Billy at least made a real connection in the game. And again, was it enough to save him? No, as again, it was literally just another person on a tribe of 5, where again, he still had 3 people vehemently against him. But again, it's at least something. So again, while I think the rest of his game is entirely bad, I think it's like, again, those little glimmers there that are good enough to put him here at number 46. Now, number 45, and 45 is someone that I very much contemplate also considering this the worst second boot, as I think there is definitely some argument here. I think where with the likes of a Jacob and a Billy, I feel like I at least see a glimmer of potential from the fact that, again, they are fans of the show. They're, again, seemingly somewhat strategically minded, even though, again, they're so bad socially. This is a person that is really bad socially, while also doesn't really have a strategic mind for the game. However, I think the circumstances of them being voted out is not nearly as bad, but they're still a really terrible player, and that person is Kel Gleason from Survivor Australian Outback. And I think Kel is someone that kind of gets understated as one of the worst players in Survivor history. I think he's a player that should be set. And looking at Kel, he's one of the most physical guys on his tribe. He's the type of person that should do extremely well, especially in old school Survivor. Yet instead, he's this social outcast that everyone wants out. No one keeps him in the game. And to be fair, there is this like beef jerky gate that people kind of sketched out by him, but it was still a spot where he was just so socially awkward. And to be fair, I think beef jerky gate only plays a factor because people didn't like him to begin with. So again, I think there's a lot bad here with Kel. The reason why he's higher, though, at the end of the day than Billy and Jacob is, again, I think Billy having his tribe throw the challenge to vote him out is much worse, where obviously Ogre didn't, and I don't think actively wanted Kel out. I think it was more so a spot, obviously, where they had to because they had to vote someone out, which, again, is at least slightly better. And in comparison to Jacob Derwin, obviously Jacob Derwin was going to be the first boot and got saved by a twist, even get to the second boot roll. So, again, I think Kel is at least better than them in that sense, though, to be honest, when I do get around the ranking every Survivor player again, I could definitely see Kel being very much towards the bottom of the list. But again, in this spot, he is here at number 45. Number 44, and this one's a tough one, as I think this is a player that has a lot of disadvantages in the game. This is a player that, and when looking back at my first boot ranking, I consider putting them higher on the list because, again, on that first boot ranking, there's like this grouping of players that, again, are just looked at as like physically weak or just like naturally don't have good standing in the game that makes them not as bad as people that do things actively wrong. However, I think this person also does a lot actively wrong. So at number 44, I do have BB Anderson from Survivor Borneo. And BB's another one that I think is like a weird case here in the sense that I think he is one of the worst players to ever play Survivor, but largely on his own accord, where he's someone that I think is aware of the game of Survivor. I mean, we see him instantly talk about the concept of alliances and talks to Ramona, how if they were going to play the game optimally, they should be working together. And again, I think he gets the strategic aspects of Survivor. I just don't think he cares about Survivor and didn't want to play the game and didn't want to gel with the people that was around him. I don't think he bothered trying to get to know them. He actively pissed off the majority of his tribe with him coming off very domineering, and just seems like a person that has very few social skills for the game, to where I think it is this, again, tough dichotomy because, again, he is obviously much older than the rest of his tribe. He is someone that, again, on paper, you could be looking at as, again, one of the physically weakest members of the tribe due to his age. So, again, he definitely does come into the game with a lot of inherent disadvantages, yet I think he plays so actively bad with those disadvantages that kind of takes him out of a tier that we're going to be talking about later that I think are people that, again, were just looked at as physical liabilities, and puts him more so in this camp of people that I think are actively bad players. So because of that, again, for me, BB's here number 44. Number 43, I mean, I thought this person would be towards the bottom. I mean, this is probably one of the worst players of Survivor history. I think you could argue this is the worst player in Survivor history. However, the reason that they're not at the very bottom of the list is because, again, they had a couple allies. That's more than you could say about any of the people we've talked about so far. So I think this is a terrible player, and in terms of like their game on this season, they at least had a point where they actually had a majority, and that person is Shannon Elkins from Survivor Nicaragua. And Shannon Elkins sucks. I mean, again, he's a terrible player, also a very questionable person, but again, there was a point where he had a majority. He had an alliance alongside Fabio and Alina and Kelly B, who were mostly loyal to him. And along with that, again, had the likes of Chase and Benry on his side, with those latter two end up flipping on him. And again, a lot of that due to his own actions. I do think he very much pushes away his own allies. And to be fair, I think Brenda also does some good work in pulling over Chase to the other side as well. But I do think Shannon comes off very domineering, also comes off very chauvinistic and homophobic, to where, again, I think that also pushed away some people as well, to where, while, again, the fatal flaw for his game is more so losing Chase, I do think he does a lot of active work around that to just further sink his ship. And, again, at the end of the day, I think Shannon's a player that I think is terrible. I think if you put Shannon on any season, I think he does terribly. I think while he may be able to get on people's good graces initially, I think he'll very likely further turn them away as the season goes on. I think there are at least minor pros to his game in comparison to like BB and Kel and Billy and Jacob, who never really had any true solid allies, where even Shannon here, even after he has this big blow up and makes these questionable comments at Tribal, he still has Fabio and Kelly B voting alongside him. To where, again, I think that does show that he at least had some people that were like fully loyal to him, to where, again, that's at least something. To where, while I think he's a terrible player, one of the worst players of all time, it's enough to be here at number 43 on this list. Now 42, and I'll say this one was a bit of a tough one. I mean, this next grouping we're going to be talking about are people that I think played kind of actively bad, but I do question how actively bad they played, and I had a tough time wrapping my head around where exactly they should be landing. Yeah, at 42 here, I'm going to be putting Christine Shields Murkowski from Survivor South Pacific. And again, this one's a bit tough, as I think when looking back at my first boot ranking, I had someone like Francesca, who I think makes a similar mistake to Christine, where I think the big fatal mistake for Christine is, again, right away, right on the offset, she goes and tells Coach that he's a temporary player, which is like such a questionable move. Obviously puts a big bullseye in your back, especially from Coach, who is a returning player and you know is going to have some influence in the game. And too fair, I think people looked at Coach as a joke. Maybe she thought the same and that he would never be able to gain influence, but she's wrong. So again, she does become a big target. Following that, and again, I think when looking at someone like Francesca, who I think was in a similar spot, I had Francesca much higher on my first boot ranking than I do have Christine here. However, I think there's a couple differences in this case. I think there's one, I think the fact that, unlike Francesca, I think Francesca almost pulled over a coup, kind of. Again, she did get Christina and Philip, and they, again, organized this potential idol play, while with Christine, she was just on the bottom alongside Stacy. Again, she had an ally in Stacy, that's something. But again, they were both on the bottom. Other side just splits the vote against them, and Christine never really is able to do anything beyond that. But also, I think when looking at obviously the second boots, I think a lot of the second boots are better than the first boots. I think that's also something that drives Christine further on the list here as well, where I did have this big debate in my head of like, how bad is Christine really? When again, had she been a first boot, I think she would have been, again, probably middle of the road on the first boot ranking. But again, when looking at the second boot ranking, again, I do think she, again, does very actively bad play in her pissing off Coach at the very beginning. That puts this bullseye on her back. And then again, beyond that, is never able to gain any social capital outside of just building a relationship with Stacy, who is also on the bottom. To where, again, I did feel like Christine ends up being a pretty bad player on this season. So again, she's here at number 42. Number 41, another one. I very much debate on where exactly land this person, because I feel like for me, a lot of this person's game is kind of tainted by post-game stuff, to where I actually had to sit down and properly assess what do I think of this player as they played on this season, and I still don't really know how to comprehend this player. And that player is Jeremy Crawford from Survivor David vs. Goliath. And I mean, Jeremy in itself is obviously one of these like weird circumstances that he's even on this list, where I think most people consider him a third boot. But again, I think because of Pat's medevac, he's here as a second boot, and even then, again, he's still the first person voted out of this tribe anyway. And again, I think Jeremy is just a weird player here. I think when looking at how he played on his season, yes, he did come off as paranoid. At points, he did turn away allies. He had someone like a Mike White wanting to work with him initially, but then backs away by the end. He also was trying to work Natalie, but never could get Natalie to work alongside him. And instead, they had this big feud. He pushes away the majority alliance, to where someone like Angelina becomes very anti-Jeremy by the time he goes home, to where there's a lot really bad on paper there. I think really there's serious arguments that he's worse than even Shannon and Elkins, considering the fact that, again, at least Shannon had a couple people remaining loyal to him. Jeremy didn't. However, I think when looking back on the footage of the season, I don't really see him doing as much like actively wrong as someone like Shannon. And again, I really went back and watched moments of David vs. Goliath, and I don't think he does that much wrong, at least from what we're shown on the show. So again, there are these issues, and that's why he's this low on this list. Again, I don't feel like he has the low lows of, again, a Shannon Elkins who's like very demeaning to his allies and makes questionable comments here and there, or again, someone like a BB who doesn't even try to talk to his fellow players. Again, he's not like Jacob Derwin that couldn't even build a real relationship while out there. Again, we at least see Jeremy and Mike get along right away. Where again, I just think that like when looking on the actual evidence we have, I don't don't know how much of it is like really all-time bad. Now, again, from post-show, I think post-show actions, I do get a lot more of the vibe that, yeah, he is a genuinely terrible player. But again, when actually looking at the evidence on the season, I didn't see as many major mistakes as the people below him. So again, for that alone, he is at least here at number 41. Next up at number 40, we're moving on to a player that at the end of the day, I think is very similar to Jeremy in terms of how their games played out, where, I mean, really, it's kind of like a mix of Jeremy and Christine. But I think I probably have more reason to think this person had a bit more potential to make it deeper into this season than someone like Jeremy did on his season. And that person's Candace Smith from Survivor Tocantins. And Candace is this weird player where, again, I think she does play pretty poorly. Again, like Christine, she does actively target coach from very early on, gets back to coach. He actively wants to target her back. Also, like Jeremy, again, had an ally in Aaron. Though, I mean, to be fair, had Aaron alongside her for most of it. I mean, I believe the story is that Aaron switched her vote at the very last second because she kind of got the vibe that Candace was getting voted out. But again, until that very last second, Aaron was fully intending on working with Candace. Or again, unlike Jeremy, who again had pushed away Mike before they even went to tribal, I feel like, again, that's at least a minor positive there for Candace. And I at least respect that. Again, Candace at least had the gusto in the game to be actively maneuvering through the game, where again, even some like Christine, where even though we do see Christine openly target coach at the very beginning, I don't feel like she does much active work beyond that to actually get that target painted on coach, or at least we do see Candace actively campaigning to go for coach. And to be fair, is that bad? Probably. I mean, it does put a bigger bullseye on her back, but I at least respect the gusto she has in the game. But again, at the end of the day, I do look at her more similarly to someone like Jeremy. And again, I think if we're basing this off what we saw on the show, I think I actually probably think Candace does more actively wrong. But again, I do think I see more potential there at Candace, especially again for this specific season. But again, I think Jeremy was kind of screwed no matter where he went in the game. I don't think anyone really wanted to work with him beyond that point that he was voted out. Where again, with Candace, she at least had Aaron, who I still think would have been an ally for her. Where again, at the end of the day, it's very, very close. It's pretty marginal between her and Jeremy. I decided to go Candace above her. She's here at number 40. Now number 39. And now we're moving on to a player that I struggle where exactly to land them. I think there's an argument they should be potentially lower. Yeah, I also feel like they don't do as much actively wrong, but they don't do anything necessarily right either. But at number 39, I do have Morgan McDevitt from Survivor Guatemala. And Morgan, like, I think on paper, you can argue she should be higher on this list, like more in line with the people that were voted out, just due to them being, like, again, social outcasts / physically weaker. Yeah, Morgan is kind of in the spot, though, where she wasn't really that physically weak. It's not like people voted her out because she was bad at challenges. She was actually decent at challenges. People voted her out because they thought she was lazy. They didn't do anything around camp. To where, again, I don't think anyone necessarily had this like big vendetta against Morgan, but I just think she was like a largely expendable player on this season that just got voted out because she wasn't really doing anything in comparison to someone like Lydia, where people liked Lydia. Again, people wanted to keep Lydia around. Well, Morgan, and again, didn't really bring anything to any of the power players, where again, she just became a very easy person to vote out. So where, again, because of that, I find it tough to rank Morgan, where again, I think there's an argument, again, maybe she should be on where BB and Kel are. More particularly Kel, in the spot where, again, like, there's no reason why she should have been the first boot here. Again, had she been a somewhat competent player, she should have easily been able to skate through this first round through her, again, just being decent in challenges. But again, it seemed like she just completely lacked any social capital. But beyond that, I also, like, struggle because, like, I don't see anything that she does, like, actively wrong either. Like, I don't think I can name a single thing outside of, again, just the general concepts of her being lazy and not really building any connections that I can truly fault her for. Like, there's no real big, like, strategic misstep or anything she does to, like, actively push people away. It's more so just her not doing anything that pushes people away. So again, in comparison to the likes of like Candace, Jeremy, Christine, especially Shannon, again, these people that actively push away people, I don't feel like Candace really does that. I feel like she just passively does so. So again, for me, I guess that's better. And that's why she's here at number 39. Now number 38. And this is another player I very much contemplate putting lower, where this is a player that I actually thought would be towards the bottom. I thought this would be like a spot above Shannon Elkins. However, I thought about it a bit more. I think they're a little bit better, though still not particularly great. And that person is Matt Quinlan from Survivor One World. And again, Matt is a player that initially thought he was in the majority alliance. Again, he initially had this big bro alliance alongside Jay and Bill and Michael, and he thought they were running the show. And to be fair, for all we know, potentially would have. Where, again, based on how the show portrays it, at least, Colton ends up getting an idol, is able to gain influence with that idol and pick up all the stragglers and lead this vote against him. Again, is that actually the reality? I don't know. But if that is the reality, that is probably decent for Matt. The fact that obviously Colton only gets the idol because Sabrina gives the idol to him. It's not even like Colton found the idol himself, to where, again, I think if that is the case, again, I would say, okay, there's a little bit some wonkiness here, as again, it feels like he's like minorly getting screwed over by the One World twist, though in itself, I do think there is still some actively bad play from him. Again, he does obviously very much isolate isolate specific people on his tribe. He comes off extremely domineering to where by the end, only Michael wanted to save him, with even Bill and Jay turning their backs on him, to where, again, I think there's definitely an argument he should be closer to Shannon Elkins. Yeah, I don't feel like Matt does, again, as much like actively wrong as Shannon Elkins. Well, again, you can argue minorly that he gets screwed over by the one world twist. And also, like, I think he's also disadvantaged from being on a tribe of all men, where I do think if he was in a spot where the tribes have been mixed, I think there's more of a shot that Matt is kept around wanting physical strength. Though, again, in a tribe of all men, I don't think there's as much incentive for that. So, yeah, I think you can kind of say he got a little bit screwed over by certain aspects of the game. It's enough for me to not put him at the very, very bottom. Again, he's here at number 38. And number 37, another player that I remember at the time of this person getting voted out, I was thinking, is this one of the worst players of all time? I think I've softened on that. I don't really think that's the case anymore, but there is a lot of bad here, and that person is from the most recent season of the show. We got TK Foster from Survivor 47, and again, TK is in this spot where, again, he's not one of these people that, like, has no reason to be the first boot. And TK is like another one of these people that, like, had no reason to be an early boot. I think it's actually mind-blowing that TK, probably the most physical person on his tribe, is the second boot of the season. And I'll say a lot of that I do think is on him. I think he plays actively bad. And how, yes, he did have this really strong connection with Kyle, but he tries to pull in Tiana, but then also doesn't even really bother building a relationship with Tiana, like leaves Kyle to do that for him, which is, again, questionable, as obviously that makes it more likely that he's going to be cut over Kyle. Also, he had this, like, feud with Sue that, to be fair, I don't know how much I really fault him for, where it seemed like from his exit press at least that Sue was very anti him to begin with, and that might stem back to him going on the journey, which, again, might be also an aspect of him being very unfortunate, and him being the one to end up going there. Though, to be fair, he wanted to go into the journey, so I guess you can fault him for that as well. But him being away from his tribe in the opening moments, I think could definitely be a negative for him. Now, beyond that, I also think he does actively sour his position in the game, but that's also in the spot where it seems to be based on a misunderstanding, where obviously he goes on this big spiel after they lose the challenge about how people shouldn't be smiling, and again, Tiana gets pissed off by that because she was the one smiling, and that leads to her flipping on him. But, like, the reality is that he didn't know that she was the one smiling. So, right, obviously, yeah, fault him for saying a comment like that, but again, he didn't know he was taking a shot at Tiana through saying that. So, again, I think that's a little bit of grace I'm willing to give him in that spot. Now, beyond that, again, like, I still think it's ridiculous that he is the second boot of the season. He has no reason to be. He is one of the biggest physical assets of the tribe, and I do think it is very bad that he is the second boot of the season. I think there's at least some rationales for his bad play at points, though. Still, again, I still think the fact that he is taken out in this spot is very, very damning. So, again, for me, he's here at number 37. Now, number 36, moving on to a player that I actually think this person could potentially be a competent player had they been given a better starting tribe. However, again, based on what we're shown, it's not really great, and that player is Betsy Bolin from Survivor Samoa. And again, Betsy's a player that I actually think had potential. Again, she is on to Russell from the very beginning, knows exactly what he's doing, calls him out for his shit, openly distrusts him, tells others to distrust him, and to be fair, again, that's maybe some of the bad part, the fact that she tells people that would relay it back to Russell that she's coming after him. Again, that is definitely potentially bad, but again, she had the correct read. Again, she just didn't have the social capital to do anything about it. Because of that, again, I think you could definitely argue that she should be lower towards the likes of Candace and the likes of Christine. However, for me, one of the aspects that she's higher here is because she does survive a vote. I mean, she actually does go to tribal twice, and to be fair, that is something of the second boot ranking that's a bit wonky. Obviously, some of these people got voted out at their first opportunity. Some of these people didn't and survived the tribal, and that is something that will be playing a factor here. I think there are people that survived the tribal that may be very similar to people that didn't survive a tribal, but because they did survive a tribal, there are a few spots higher. As again, I do think that is obviously a boon. You did survive a single round of gameplay where another person didn't. So again, that's something. Now, I will say it's not a major boon for Betsy here in this spot because Betsy was on the outs during the first vote. It's not like she had any real control over that first vote. Again, she sided with Marisa. Marisa still gets voted out. She's just on the bottom immediately afterwards. And again, she does get into feud with like Ben, and to be fair, it's Ben Browning. But again, she does get into fights with him. Again, that's not good. But again, I think she at least had some potential, and she survived a vote. I think it's good enough for me to be here at number 36. Now, at number 35, a pretty similar thing, obviously different circumstances, but at least similar on paper, and that person is Roxy Morris from Survivor Philippines. And again, same thing. Roxy survives a tribal. Again, votes out Zane Knight. At least is in the majority for that. So that's something. But immediately following that, again, does very much openly target the likes of Malcolm and Angie. So by the end, Denise ends up siding with them over her. And again, I think with Roxy here, there's a lot of pros and cons in comparison to Betsy. Again, at the end of the day, I think they are very similar. I think their games play out in very similar ways. And a pro for Roxy, obviously, again, she voted in the majority of the first tribal. That's something. Also, by the time she gets voted out, she had Russell Swan wanting to keep her, but Russell only flips at the last second because he realized that she was going home. But again, he actually wanted to keep her in the game. If Denise had sided with them, then again, Roxy would have stayed. invade. But again, obviously that doesn't happen. Now, I will say, I think something that I would actually say is a pro for Betsy over Roxy is the fact that Roxy does get voted out here over a perceived couple in the game. Or again, on a tribe of 5, the fact that the others were willing to let Angie and Malcolm both go to 4, I think is pretty damning. Now, I think you could also say that considering Malcolm and Denise were together, and Denise, again, had more trust in Malcolm than Russell Swan, obviously, again, I get the decision there. I think it is the right decision, but I do think, at least on paper, it does feel very rocky that she lost a battle in her being taken out over, again, a perceived duo that would then become half of the tribe following that. In comparison, again, someone like Betsy, who I think it makes sense that she's voted out over Ben Browning, who is one of the most physical people on his tribe. Where, again, I think that is something I would give to Betsy there, though. Again, I think it is the fact that, again, she survives the tribal, had a more solid ally alongside her. Again, that does put Roxy a spot higher here at number 35. Now, number 34, and this is kind of the end of the bottom tier for me, where it is the player that, again, I think on paper you would have him lower. I think this is someone that is talked about as one of the worst players of all time. And again, I think there's definitely an argument for it. Yeah, I think when looking at their game, there's at least a major positive here for this person. That person is Garrett Adelstein from Survivor Cagayan. And again, Garrett, I think, does a lot wrong. He obviously comes off very domineering. He pushes away allies. He gets taken out over Jatia, who literally just dumped the tribe's rice. Again, that is very, very bad. However, I think something that fundamentally puts him higher than literally any of the people we've talked about so far is the fact that he actually did control the first vote. And he is a person that went to 2 tribals, gets voted out as second tribal, but during the first tribal, he is the main orchestrator of the David Sampson vote. He does put together his majority alliance alongside Spencer, Tasha, and Jatia that organized the votes there. Also, initially, it seemed like he was in a pretty good spot following that vote, with him doing a lot of work and trying to pull in Cass and obviously having Spencer by his side. Again, I think take his first 1.5 rounds of gameplay, I think he's actually one of the best second boots on the board. The problem is that the end of his second round is so astronomically bad. Again, the fact that they vote him out over Jatia is pure insanity. And the fact that he also had an idol that he could have saved himself, which, to be fair, isn't that major of a knock. At the end of the day, it's like, if many of these second boots had idols, I don't know if they would have saved themselves with it anyway. But it obviously does show a lack of awareness for Garrett here. And in general, I think Garrett might be the second boot that does some of the most actively bad play of any of the people here, but also has some of the higher highs as well. And I think that's what makes him tough to assess here, is that really, I mean, as we'll talk about with this list, there's not many second boots that actually controlled the first vote. Where, yeah, there are people that voted with the majority, but many of those people were people that were either just inherently on the bottom or people that were kind of expendable within their majority group, to where Garrett was someone that was literally at the top of the pecking order for that first vote. And I think that is something that, again, at least is something to praise him for. But again, I think his end of his game is so actively bad to where I think that's enough to demerit him to where he's here at number 34. Now, number 33, and here we're starting off the middle tier of the list. We're starting it off with a little subgroup here of players that, again, I think were the physical, social outcasts / physical weaknesses to the tribe, people that weren't really set up particularly well coming into the season, but doesn't do necessarily that much wrong. I think this is kind of the epitome of that. At number 33, we're starting that off with Simone from Survivor HHH. And again, Simone, I just think is fine. I don't really think she does that much actively wrong. I just think she comes into the season being, again, clearly the weakest physically on her tribe, to where I feel like she became very expendable because of that. Well, also, again, socially, she wasn't great, but again, she wasn't actively bad either. Again, she does obviously lack in trying to build these personal connections with people. No one felt particularly close to her. Everyone was willing to let her go. But within that, I don't think she does that much actively wrong, though. Again, she just feels like a very baseline second boot here, and that everyone that we'll talk about beyond this, or again beyond this subgroup that we're talking about here, I think everyone beyond this has a little positive to really bring up, where I feel like Simone's kind of this person that doesn't really have a major positive, but doesn't really have a major negative either. They just kind of were just an obvious first vote off from their tribe, where again, because that, I guess, is enough to put Simone here number 33. Now number 32, similar thing, though I actually think there's more cons with this person, but there's also probably a minor pro with this person. At number 32, I have Ashley Mazzaro from Survivor China. And again, Ashley is this person that I think is actually a pretty bad player. I do think if you put her on most given seasons, I think she is very argumentative. I don't think she really blends well with most groups. I think she's probably just an easy early boost. But again, she's a wrestler. She's pretty physical. I will say major detriment to her on this season, though, is the fact that she was sick. She was sick from the very beginning. Wasn't really able to showcase any of her physical prowess. And through that, again, I think that is something that makes her a bit unlucky. And to be fair, again, we'll talk about other players that were sick early on, and they'll be much higher on this list. Yet for someone like Ashley, the reason why I didn't jump her that high on this list is because, again, I do think fundamentally, I don't really see that potential there with Ashley. Even if she wasn't sick, I do think she still would not gel for tribe. She got into arguments with Dave, or they were causing a lot of conflict, and then she would have been very easy to take out. Now, again, a pro for her is the fact that she survives a tribal. She does survive over Chicken, to where that's something. Especially considering, again, she's sick. Chicken's one of the more physical people on the tribe. Again, I think that is actually a decent positive. But also, it's like, I feel like she was in a position where she was always going to be the second boot. Like, even if she was not sick, I think she was still always, like, socially positioned to be in that spot to where, and that's kind of the reason why I didn't really jump her much higher, where, again, I think the people that we will talk about that were, again, sick and became the second boots, because I think there are people that probably would have made it further in the game had they not been sick. I don't think that's necessarily the case with Ashley here. So, again, that's why I did leave her here at number 32. Now, number 31, I mean, this is kind of like a mix of multiple things. Now, number 31, a similar thing to Ashley, though I think this person has a lot of more inherent disadvantages coming into the game. That person is Jillian Larson from Survivor Gabon. And I think Jillian is, again, debatably one of the worst players of all time. I think she's a player that doesn't really have much potential in most of given seasons. I think you put her on any season, she's usually the first or second boot every single time. However, I think that's also something that's kind of a pro for her. The fact that, again, she was so disadvantaged in this season, someone that just inherently would never make it deep into the game. And again, she survived the vote. She survived over Michelle Chase. That's something. Now, again, it's not much, but again, we're talking about second boots here. And I think for someone that, again, just inherently has no real shot at the game, the fact that she, again, at least survived the vote is a pro. Now, again, negatives, obviously, she did come up very annoying to her tribe. Again, people did not particularly like her. But again, I think she does less actively wrong than someone like Ashley, to where I guess is enough to put her here at number 31. Now, number 30, moving on to another person that has a lot of inherent disadvantages coming into this season. Though I think their vote off seems to be a little bit wonkier, and that person is Janet Koth from Survivor the Amazon. And I think Janet might be one of the biggest, like, non-factors in the history of the show. I don't think she really does much across her run, to where, again, I think in most given situations, I think she's essentially just Simone. I mean, someone that didn't really build any bonds with her tribe, though wasn't like actively bad in that. It was just like, again, inherently looked at as the weakest on her tribe. She's the oldest person of her tribe. And I think there's just a lot of inherent disadvantages for Janet to where she would be an early boot. The reason I do have her higher is, I mean, the vote that she gets voted out in is a lot rockier than what it should have been. I mean, there's a lot of like stray votes going all over the place. So again, her vote off is one that not even everybody was necessarily on board with. And even beyond that, I feel like Janet gets some like misfounded controversy surrounding her that also tanked her position. Or you obviously have like the granola bar controversy, where people found a granola bar wrapper and assumed that it was Janet that snuck into the game when supposedly it was probably production. So I think she gets unlucky in that sort of situation as well. That kind of loses her standing in the game as well. Where, again, I think at the end of the day, Janet is, again, kind of just like a non-factor. She doesn't really do much actively bad, but doesn't really do anything well either. But I think considering this like controversy, it's enough, I guess, to put her above the people that are similar to her but don't have that controversy. So again, it's enough to put her here at number 30. Now, number 29. And this is a bit of a weird case where I think this is kind of like a transitionary player on this list, kind of still keeping with these people that I think are inherently disadvantaged on their seasons. I don't think it's a person that was ever really going to do well on their season, especially considering their tribe makeup. And again, did want to quit, but again, showed a little bit more potential in the game. That player is Jess Chong from Survivor 46. And again, I said at the time, I think Jess is one of the worst players. And well, again, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I do think she's someone that's probably not meant to be playing Survivor. I don't think she's really going to do well in most given situations. However, again, considering the game played out in 46, again, there's at least some positives. Again, she survived the vote. She survived over Jelinski. Now, again, she was the primary backup target during that vote and probably would have been booted had Jelinski not pissed off Q along the way. But still, I mean, Jess, I still think does some good work on the season in terms of, like, she had a good connection with Q. I assume that's probably part of the reason why Q wanted Jelinski out before her. So again, that's something. And even in her boot round, I think she does show some awareness at points. Again, she does recognize the idol that she's been given is a fake idol. Or at least there's that. Also, I do think she does good work in trying to paint this target onto Kenzie. And while, again, I don't know if it would have ever been effective for someone like Tiffany, I think she does play optimally during that round of trying to get Q on board to flip against Kenzie because Kenzie's closer to Tiffany, and again, seemingly gets Tiffany to at least question Kenzie. Again, there's at least something there. Is it good in the grand scheme of things? Not really. But again, I think she's someone that I guess just naturally was not going to really fit on that tribe. I think in most situations, she would be the first person out of that tribe. And the fact that she wasn't even the first out of that tribe is, again, at least something. So again, I don't think Jess is particularly good, but again, I think there's at least some minor positives here that leave her here at number 29. Now, number 28. And we're still keeping with people that, again, were looked at as physical weaknesses in the tribe, though I think they had a little bit more going for their games. We're going to start this group off with Ryan Shoulders, Skinny Ryan from Survivor Pearl Islands. And again, Skinny Ryan, I think, is this player that I think kind of gets talked about as this joke, though I actually think Skinny Ryan, like, is a fine second boot here. I mean, he's someone that like Jess, again, potentially would have been the first boot. He seemed to be primed to be the first boot, where, again, someone like Savage just inherently did not like Skinny Ryan from the very beginning, wanted him out because of him being a wimpy little non-leader, which, I mean, I'll clarify, I do know that was said about Steven. But yeah, obviously his parallel with Skinny Ryan here as well. I think that's a major reason why Ryan gets put on the bottom from the very beginning. I don't think he necessarily does anything wrong. I don't think people necessarily dislike Skinny Ryan, but I think he just had this person that was leading the tribe, and Andrew Savage just being so against him from the very beginning, with him looking at him as just such a weakness to the tribe. And beyond that, again, he obviously built this very strong connection with Lil. I think Lil would have done anything to keep Skinny Ryan in the game. And again, he had the social capital of Lil, where Lil actually does put in good work for him, and throwing Nicole under the bus and getting Nicole voted out. Well, also, again, we see him have like a seemingly decent relationship with someone like an Austin. Again, I think in the grand scheme of things, I think had he been given a different tribe, I think Skinny Ryan probably actually does competently in the game. And again, he is a fan of the show. I think he would at least know what he's supposed to be doing strategically. Where again, I don't think Skinny Ryan's that bad, but obviously on this season, again, he was almost the first boot, gets saved largely because Nicole ends up putting her own foot in her mouth, then proceeds to just get voted out immediately afterwards. So again, it's not good, but again, I think there's at least some minor pros there for me that leave him here at number 28. Now, number 27, similar thing. I mean, similar spot in the game. I think probably showed themselves to be a little bit more cutthroat of a player, though, and that player is Keith Sowell from Survivor Edge of Extinction. And again, I think Keith is another one. I think he's probably an understated player. I think if Keith probably played the game a little bit older, I think he would have a lot of potential. I mean, he seemed to, again, know how he should be playing the game strategically. Again, he seemed to be a big fan of the show. He knew that him and Reem were on the bottom and that the votes were going towards them. He proceeds to flip on Reem. Again, something that I don't think Skinny Ryan was ever going to do. I don't think Skinny Ryan was ever going to vote out Lil, where, again, I think Keith does. I think that's a pro against Keith. Saves himself from that first vote more actively, for sure. And beyond that, again, he gets voted out second, but I actually don't think he does that much actively wrong to get voted out second. Again, he's just looked at as his physical weakness to the tribe. So I think he just came off very expendable because of that. However, there were people that wanted to keep him around. Again, he had a good relationship with Chris. Chris wanted to keep him around, but just didn't feel like it was worth pissing off the others to do so. He also had like a good connection to the likes of Rick and David, to where, again, had Rick and David actually decided to make the move that they talked about a lot against Kelly Wentworth, I think Keith could have been in a pretty good spot, but obviously he fails in getting to do so. But, and obviously, again, like I think a lot of people will kind of trash him because he came off so delusional in the way he left the game and talking about how you think you're going to win challenges now after he gets voted out. And again, that's just funny. But I don't think that really is a true indictment against his game. I think he is a player. Again, I think he's a very crafty player. I think he's someone that put him on any given season, especially, again, much older, more life experience. I think he could play very well. Again, I think the fact that he, again, throws Reem under the bus to survive that first round, I think shows some game ability there. And then he had connections by the time he left, where, again, I think he still falls into like kind of the Ryan Shoulders category, but I think had a little bit more cutthroatness to him, to where that's why he's here at number 27. Number 26, similar thing. I mean, I think this one's a little bit more rocky because there's some other weird circumstances pertaining to his boot, but we do have Brandon Donlin. And again, Brandon is in this spot here where, yes, he is the second boot of his tribe. And I think Brandon kind of gets very unfortunate in the fact that he's like really on one of the worst tribes in Survivor history. That Costa goes to tribal and there only being 6 people, to where obviously, again, he is a part of that. Again, he is a major reason why they were doing so bad at challenges. But I think Brandon inherently, though, is very skilled for the game. I mean, he is a super fan, to where I think most of the times he should know his optimal move. Now, again, at the end of the day, I don't think he is the most cutthroat player in the world. I think he is someone that is a much more social player. And I think that's really a strong suit. I think Brandon is probably one of the best social players of this entire group that we're going to be talking about. I think he is someone that is adored by most people. Like, even before the season even started, there was so many people online talking about how much they loved Brandon Donlin and their own interactions with him before he got on the show, and even post-show. Again, people just adore Brandon Donlin, to where, again, I think he is someone that is very good socially. So I think had he been given a bigger tribe, a tribe that wouldn't really need to vote out people for physical strength in the way that Lulu did, I think he has a lot of potential in the game. Beyond that, also, I think it's very unfortunate in Hannah Rose winning in the first round, where more than likely Emily was going to be the first boot of the season, and had Hannah not quit round 1, and should be there to quit round 2. Again, maybe Brandon makes it deeper in the game at that point. I think he gets unfortunate that he loses his number 1 ally in that first round of the game through quitting the game, in a spot where they both would have been around for the second round had that not happened. Or, again, I think there's some wonkiness here. I think at the end of the day, again, yes, he is still similar to the likes of Keith and the likes of Ryan Shoulders, but I think he, again, has more wonkiness related to his game than those other two. So for me, it's enough to put him here in number 26. Number 25. And now we're starting off a new sub-tier of the list. I mean, a grouping of people here that were inherently on the bottom, but again, at least had allies and had some like unfortunate circumstances pertaining to their boots. And I think probably had potential had they been able to make it past their boot round. So we're going to be starting out with Helen Lee from Survivor 44. And Helen's this player that I don't think does that much wrong, but also doesn't really do that much like actively right either. They just feel like a very baseline player here that, again, had an ally in Sarah Wade and gets a bit unfortunate the fact that Sarah loses her vote, but at the same time, I think Helen was going to be voted out anyway. Also gets unfortunate the fact that Bruce gets medevaced, where obviously that has one less person on the tribe that she could potentially win over, though also at the same time, I think she probably gets voted out even if Bruce was there anyway, where I think Bruce is probably more likely to side with the Carolyn, Jam Carson side of things, though, again, she was someone that at least had game going on. Again, she had an alliance with Sarah and Carson, only for Carson obviously end up flipping on her, but again, had she been able to win over that one vote, she probably is in a good spot to make it pretty deep into the game, which, I mean, to be fair, is kind of just new era in general, where obviously there's not much game to be had in the pre-merge, where if you're just able to get in a good position from the very beginning, you're probably going to be able to ride that to Mergatory at least. But still, I think Ellen is someone that I do think has potential in the game. I think she seemed to be actively playing the game, thought she was in a good position, just turned out, again, one of the people that she thought she had, she didn't really have. And even then, there wouldn't have even been incentive for Carson to side with them, even after Sarah lost her vote anyway, as again, why go to a tie? I think at the end of the day, it's like, I think on paper you could look at her as a bit screwy, as it gave her very few options after Sarah lost her vote. But at the end of the day, I think it would have played out the same anyway. But I still do think she's a pretty competent player. When I got in a pretty unfortunate position here, and would have had potential had she been past that position, but again, didn't. But at the end of the day, again, that's enough to put her here number 25. Now number 24. Now we're moving on to a very similar thing. I think the one big pro for this person, they survived the vote when the other person didn't. And outside that, again, a lot of their games pretty similar. But either way, we do have David Voce from Survivor 41. And again, I think Voce is someone that I was expecting to come into the season being a terrible player. I thought he would be this very narcissistic, egotistical player that would blow up his own game in the same way like a Garrett Adelstein or a Shannon Elkins. But no, he was a pretty competent player. I mean, he is someone that was on the bottom inherently. Again, right away, there was this like all women's group that formed that had a decent stronghold. And again, you can definitely fault Voce for voting out Abraham. That put him on the bottom. But considering, again, he thought that he had Evie on his side, I get why he does it. And obviously, again, at the end of the day, his main fatal flaw is the fact that he doesn't maintain Evie's loyalty, and to be fair, never really had it. But outside that, though, I don't feel like he does anything like actively bad. I mean, there's just, again, so little room to maneuver on a 6-person tribe. I mean, 5 by that point. Also, Xander had lost his vote through him getting the Beware advantage, which gave him even less possibilities, and also made Xander the sitting duck, to where, again, there was less incentive to vote out Xander because you could just easily vote him out next time. And again, considering also the fact that him and Xander got picked to do the sweat task in a spot where I think that inherently disadvantaged him as well, and putting him in like a vulnerable spot from the very beginning, to where I think that made it more likely that he would have catered to this like all women's group that formed right away. Again, I think there are some other wonky circumstances here to where I don't think Voce's that bad, but also, again, there's not really much to truly praise either. So again, it's enough to be here number 24. And now number 23, another person that I think gets pretty unfortunate in the game, though also they're probably in that position anyway. But either way, we do have Rachel Fogler from Survivor Blood vs. Water. And I mean, this is a position where Rachel, again, was the second vote of the season. Again, there were Candace and Laura that got voted out first, technically, but I'm not including those. But even then, she survived another vote. She survived 2 votes. She survived over Laura and she survived over Marissa. That's pretty unprecedented for a second boot. But again, when looking at her game beyond that, again, she was largely expendable. She didn't really have any true alliances in the game. I mean, she had a connection with John Cody, and John Cody wanted to protect her, but couldn't by the end. So, I mean, even in comparison to the likes of Voce and Helen, at least they had like actual loyal number ones in, again, Sarah Wade and Xander, which, again, Rachel didn't necessarily have here. But as I said, she survived 2 votes. That's something. But also, I think the big thing is I do think she also gets very unlucky that this is a Blood versus Water season, and considering the twist that was had, I think that made there even more incentive to throw Rachel in. And as they were hoping that by voting Rachel out, they could then get Tyson to swap places with her, weakening the other tribe. And I think that was a major motivation for them making the move when they did. Now, I think also the connection John Cody could have been something precarious as well that put a bullseye on her back. But I do think more than likely, had that twist not existed, I think they more than likely just vote out someone like a Katie or a Sierra in that spot, who was very clearly weaker in challenges, where Rachel was probably one of the stronger women on the tribe, at least on paper. So I think she gets very unfortunate in how that plays out. But still, outside that, again, she never really was any part of any solid grouping. That, again, makes her placement here a little bit rocky, but I decided to end up landing here at number 23. Now, number 22, another weird circumstance of a player here, one that never was in a good position, but gets very unfortunate by certain other things happening around her, and that player is Mariah Sharon from Survivor 42. And Mariah, again, is in this weird spot where she was probably always going to be the second boot from her tribe, where how the initial tribe laid out is that her and Jackson were very close, and the likes of Jonathan, Lindsay, and Omer were like the real core, with Maryanne kind of straggling alongside them. So again, in most situations, I think Mariah is always going to be the second boot after Jackson. But that's where we get to the tricky thing, because again, Jackson got medevaced / ejected from the game, to where again, she kind of loses her safety net due to nothing that she actively did wrong. And I think that's something that props her up on this list. Now, at the end of the day, again, she should be like pretty similar to the likes of like a Janet Koth. I think she's higher as, again, I think she at least had a saving grace that was kind of stripped away from her, to where, again, in most given situations, she's probably not the second boot of the season, where she simply is because Jackson didn't tell production about what medications he was taking. For a while, again, I don't think Mariah necessarily plays particularly well outside that. Again, I think Tribe didn't really gel with her. I mean, I believe she was like kind of closed off and was facing some demons while out there. For also, I think like just the timing of everything was probably not great for her. But I do think, again, in most given situations, I don't think she's the first boot from her tribe. So that's something. And because that, she's here number 22. Now, number 21, and now we're kind of moving into the next like sub tier of the list, where I think these are players that played a bit more actively bad. I think these are players that, for a while, there are major pros to their games, there's also major negatives. And again, we are getting to the more like active players of the game at this point in the list, and starting all that off with Dolly Neely from Survivor Vanuatu, which, again, I think you could definitely argue that Dolly should be higher. I think Dolly is a player that had the majority of the tribe on her side at first, where she was this major swing vote. She had this young women's group that she ends up voting with by the end. That should have been the inherent majority. She also had a connection to the older women's side of things. And again, was this person perfectly fitted in the middle? The problem is she doesn't commit to either of them and plays very wishy-washy, to the point where Eliza ends up flipping on her and she gets voted out in a 5-4 vote. And I think that's entirely on Dolly. To where, again, I think the fact that she was in this major swing position is a very good thing for her game. I think probably one of the biggest pros for any of the people on this list, where I think there are very few people that were as well positioned as Dolly was at a point in the game that are on this list. So I think that's a major pro for Dolly, but again, she just actively sabotages her game so much, where again, she is entirely at fault for her boot. She had no reason to be the second boot of the season, but then played so poorly that she painted that bullseye on her back. So again, I think that is something that is very tough to wrap my head around. I think, again, there is arguments for her being higher on this list, but I think she plays so actively bad. That's a knock against her as well. And I think the big pro for her, in the sense that, like, again, realistically, she should probably be around Garrett Adelstein if I'm really docking her completely for her own elimination. I think the reason why she's not that low is that by the time she goes out, she essentially goes out in a spot where she still has 3 other people actually voting with her, siding with her, wanting her to stay. Well, also, even Eliza didn't even want her out and just, again, voted her out. At least Eliza thought she would go home if she didn't do that, to where even that's like a bit of a wonky vote, to where I think there's at least, like, again, some leeway there, to where, well, I think Dolly does a lot actively bad. I think it's enough to put her here at number 21. Now, number 20, and now we're getting to these people that, again, had big backings in the game, had a solid place in the minority alliance, but also were in a minority alliance, and we're starting that off with Ali Povitz from Survivor Caramoan. And Ali is a player here that, again, was in a very clear 4-person alliance in a tribe of 10, very clearly on the bottom. And through that, I think that is very sloppy play. Now, I don't think Ali actually does the worst of her group. I actually think she's probably the most competent player of her 4. But I think it's kind of a shame that she gets taken out so early, as I think there would have been potential for Ali had she survived. Again, she was the biggest fan of those 4 people. It feels like she kind of gets sniped out of the game because people wanted to disconnect her and Reynolds, though at the same time, again, there is still very bad play in connecting herself to Reynolds in a way that they look like a showmance that put a bigger bullseye on her back. Also, again, just blatantly being part of this 4-person alliance is bad. For a while, again, they thought that they had the likes of Michael and Matt on their side. Again, they didn't. So again, I think that is bad, though. Really, I don't know how much of that is like truly on Ali. I think when we're looking at Ali herself, I don't know how much actively bad play comes from Ali. I think most of it really stems from the things that her allies were doing, but it still, again, connects to her. And to be honest, I could see like an argument that she maybe should be a little bit higher because she herself isn't doing that much actively bad, but I still feel like she's kind of in a spot where she's just this massive bullseye in the game due to the people that she connects to where, again, for me, that's enough to put her here number 20. Number 19. And now we're moving on to similar case. Again, another person had a good chunk of allies, gets kind of sniped out of the game, and that person is Mari Takahashi from Survivor Milena versus Gen X. And Mari's another one of these people that, again, had a good number of allies around her. Again, she was really close to Adam. They were kind of a duo, was very close to Hannah. Zeke ends up siding with her, even though I don't know how close they were actually, but I believe it was more so a situation of Zeke just kind of being left out of the boat. But also initially, like, Mari seemed to be in the majority. I mean, like, it did seem like initially the Triforce plus Michelle were, again, more so the, like, Allie, Hope, Reynolds, Eddie group of the season. Though this is kind of a spot where someone from outside of the Minority Alliance gets flipped on. And I think that's what kind of makes this a little bit better for Mari. Is I think she initially had a majority around her. It did seem like the majority of the tribe was very anti-Figgy and Taylor initially. Or again, they end up flipping the vote at the last second, and Mari gets sniped out in that way. And to be fair, again, I think Mari herself probably played a bit too passively. I think she definitely did not make the connections that she needed to. But again, I do think the way that she gets sniped out of the game here was in a spot where she had a lot of potential had she stayed. And it did seem like this was a very last minute flip. So for me, again, that's at least a pro against Allie. I think at the end of the day, again, their games are pretty similar. Again, they're both people that had a good backing around them. We're taken out in spots where they had, again, a little bit less than half the tribe technically on their side. Yeah, I think with Mari, again, the fact that she at least had a majority at one point, the pro for her, along with the fact that I think she probably had more long-term potential. So again, that's why Mari's here, number 19. Now, number 18. Similar thing. I think these are very, very similar players in the game. Also similar spots in the game to where actually I think it's very debatable which one should be higher. Yeah, I'm going to go with Molly from Survivor IOI. And again, Molly versus Mari, I think it's very close. I don't think there's that much of a difference between the two. I think they play very similar games. Molly was another person that initially thought she was in the majority, even when the votes end up flipping on her, which again was supposedly pretty last second. Even in that spot, she had two very solid allies that were seemingly undyingly loyal to her, the likes of Jack and the likes of Jamal. Even beyond that, we see someone like Tommy play the middle and being very conflicted over whether or not to make the move. Supposedly Dan Spilo was in a similar spot as well, where I think Molly was in a similar spot in the game as Mari. I think they have very similar trajectories. I think there's not really much different between the two for me. I think the main thing for me personally, why I'm putting Molly here over Mari, is because I do think Molly seemed to have more outs. Because I feel like the Molly vote was less damning to me than the Mari vote, where for me with the Mari vote, I think the fact that they vote out Mari over, again, a well-known showmance that also has other allies around them, I think is kind of questionable there. Well, with Molly, there wasn't really that. Where if anything, I mean, I guess like her, Jack, and Jamal were the trio of that season to be targeted. So while you could obviously very much criticize the fact that they made it so obvious how close they were, I think the fact that she had, again, a very solid trio around her, and again, her initially being in a majority, her having a lot of the swing votes being not very solidified against her. Again, I feel like it's enough. I mean, again, it's not really much of anything. At the end of the day, I think Mari and Molly are just so close, but I don't think it's really that major of a difference. Yet for this specific list, I decided to go with Molly above Mari here at number 18. Now, number 17. And this one's a bit of a weird one, where I think in many ways you can compare this player to the likes of Molly and Mari and Allie, though I think there's some other weirder circumstances around this person, and that player is Mary from Survivor Micronesia. So again, obviously most people will say, who's Mary? But I think Mary actually is one of the better second boots on the board. I think when looking at her game, I don't think she does that much actively wrong. The thing that's strange about this is that the way the show portrays her boot is not necessarily the actual reality, where, again, the show portrays it as if she was super close to Mikey B, and Mikey B was being targeted and she gets taken out as the secondary to that. To which, again, if that had fully been the case, then yeah, I mean, she would probably be closer to the likes of Allie and Molly. But the reality is that closely, that's not really the case, that she was not actually that close to Mikey B, and that was like all just kind of like a misunderstanding that people just thought she was. And it's like showmance with Mikey B when she never really was. And to be fair, again, it's still a fault on her that people had that perception and wanted to target her because of that. But again, it's still something that was completely unfounded, where it felt like it was more so based around paranoia. And to be fair, probably a good play on Tracy, where Tracy's able to convince Joel of this, put the target on Mary. But again, I don't know if Mary does that much actively wrong. I mean, supposedly she was not even really that close to Mikey B and was kind of just taken out due to this misunderstanding. But also, it still shows that she's largely expendable in the game. I mean, she's obviously someone that didn't really build close enough connections. I believe she thought she was close to the likes of like Alexis and Natalie, but again, they vote her out. So Mary, again, just didn't really seem to have any traction in the game. But again, I think she does get voted out here in a weird circumstance where a bullseye's put on her back for something that she didn't even do. It just seemed like we had a player like Joel who's just so hyper aggressive to just make a move and ended up making a move based on something that wasn't even reality. To where, again, I think there's definitely an argument Mary could be lower, but I do think Mary is someone that doesn't do that much actively wrong, cause her boot, while also, again, getting kind of voted out due to just a complete misunderstanding. And I still think her being the first boot here isn't that bad. So again, that's why she's here at number 17. Now, number 16, we're moving on to kind of a couple players in a row here that were in initial majorities, actually voted with the majority during their first votes, only to have the entire game flip on them immediately afterwards. We're going to be talking about Jennifer Lanzetti from Survivor Co. Wrong. And again, Jennifer's like a player here that seemed to be very well positioned early on, where initially we see her have this connection to Jason and Scott. She also had an alliance alongside Sydney, and they were like the core of that tribe, and she ends up being with the majority to vote out Darrell, only to have the entire game flip on her the following round. And I think this is something that, like, the show portrays this very differently than what actually happened on the island, where the show portrays it as Jennifer got paranoid and actively sabotaged her own game and had Jason and Scott turn against her, when I believe the reality is that they were actually already against her and they were always going to flip on her through the second round. And while, again, her talking with Alicia about making an all-girls alliance was definitely a factor into that, I don't think it's as much of a meltdown as what the show portrayed it, where, again, the show shows it as like, oh, she has this breakdown at Tribal that flips the votes, when, again, the reality is she was getting voted out from much earlier than that. So I think, considering that fact, again, I think she's this player that, again, like, was in this majority alliance for the first round, seemed to be pretty well positioned, only for it to completely crumble. In the second round, with Sydney kind of ratting her back out to Scott and Jason. But in the spot that she does get taken out here, I think it's a little bit questionable. Obviously, again, she was seemingly pretty loyal to Scott, and Scott flips on her for like no reason. And too, for Scott, I believe, actually votes with her, but Scott knew about the plan and was only voting with her to split the vote. But still, I think it puts Jennifer in this like kind of weird spot where like her allies were never really loyal to her, but she does end up being part of what seemed to be an initial majority alliance at the very beginning of the game, to where, again, I think it's a bit all over the place. Again, I think she's above the likes of Molly and Mari and Allie, as again, she survived the Tribal voting with the majority, which none of those three ever did. But again, considering the majority flips on her immediately afterwards, there's not much to really praise in the grand scheme of things. But again, it's enough to be here at number 16. Now, number 15, similar thing, another person, part of the majority alliance during the first vote, has the majority alliance flip on him by the time the second vote. Though this one, I think, a little bit less coherently, but either way, we do have Matt Elrod. And obviously, again, this is pertaining to Matt Elrod as of his game at the time that he was the second voted out of his tribe. So again, for situations like this, where Matt comes back to the game later, I'm not going to include that aspect of it. I'm literally just going to be talking about Matt as he was when he was the second vote out. And again, Matt is just like a very strange case here where, again, he was in the initial majority, votes out Francesca, is part of that plan, only to just be sniped out of the game second for kind of incoherent reasons, where I get that Boston Rob was worried that Matt and Andrea were getting close and that they would potentially flip on him later, but this seemed to be largely unfounded. And I know like his tribe also got annoyed at him for like shaking hands with Zapatera after the immunity challenge, but again, like that's not anything that egregious either. Like I just think Matt is just, again, this nice guy. Again, probably way too aloof for the game of Survivor, but I don't think he does like that much actively wrong to put this bullseye on his back. I think he really gets unfortunate in the fact that he's playing with Boston Rob, someone that is playing this very cutthroat game and willing to make a move like that. And while, again, I think it does serve Boston Rob in the game of showing his other allies what will happen if they do step out of line, I do still think it's a spot where, like, I don't think Matt does that much actively wrong to get targeted here. I think he seemed to just be kind of a victim of circumstance more than him doing anything actively wrong, considering the fact that, again, he at least voted in the majority through that first vote. I actually think he's, like, not a terrible second boot here. And the only reason he's not really higher is because I don't think he necessarily gets screwed either, or at least, like, didn't have that much of his tribe backing him either, where, like, by the time he goes, the only person that actively wants him to stay is someone like Andrea. So, again, his entire full alliance flips on him. I think that is, like, again, bad on paper, but I still think he is actually, like, one of the least flawed second boots on the board, even though, again, someone like Matt Elrod should never be a second boot, to where I think that's also a little bit egregious, but still, I still don't think Matt does that much wrong, to where, again, that's enough to put him here at number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to the top of this middle tier here, where beyond this, we will be getting the players that I would consider top tier second boots, for whatever that's worth. Players I think were either like screwed over or had very, very wonky circumstances linked to their boots. This is the top person that doesn't really have that, though, but I think they are kind of like a continuation of the players from earlier. These players are inherently not going to do well in a game of Survivor. Yeah, despite that, this person did decently well, despite also being a second boot. And that person is Patricia Jackson from Survivor Marquesas, where, again, Patricia on paper should be like around where Janet and where Jillian are, of these players that inherently probably aren't going to do that well in a game of Survivor. People that, again, are older than the majority of the cast, also looked at as one of the physically weakest people on the tribe. Also, to be fair, with Patricia here, did get on people's nerves, to where I think that's definitely something that you could definitely demerit her for. Really beyond that, Patricia also had a very solid alliance backing her. She was part of the initial majority alliance, where, again, her, Hunter, Gina were working with Rob and Sarah at the very beginning. They vote up Peter Harkey. Again, she survives the vote, is in the majority for that, only for her alliance to flip on her the following round, where Rob and Sarah end up siding with Sean and Vesepia and take her out. But even then, it's a 4-3 vote. She still has Gina and Hunter by her side. Again, this is coming from a person that, in most given situations, probably is the first or second boot on any given season. And considering she still ends up being the second boot, but it's the second boot in a spot where she had a good chunk of allies, actually was in the majority for that first round. I actually think it's pretty decent for Patricia here, to where, again, I don't think Patricia's a good player. I don't think she is someone that was really ever meant to be long for the game. But again, I think as a second boot here, I think, again, she's a pretty competent one that had allies backing her and came in with a lot of inherent disadvantages. So again, I think it's pretty good that she was able to do what she was even able to do on this season. So because of that, for me, she's here number 14. And now we're at number 13. With that, again, we are starting the top tier of the second boots. Again, this is kind of similar to the top tier of my first boot ranking, where, and it's not like these people are like particularly good. They're still second boots, but I think there's at least like some excuses to be made for them being early boots. And we're going to be starting this off with probably one of the most forgotten about Survivor players in the show's history. And that person is Erica from Survivor Fiji. And Erica, I think, is a player here that, like Jessica DeBen on my first boot ranking, where, again, Jessica DeBen was super high on that ranking, largely because, again, she was essentially a swap screwed first boot. And Erica is in a similar spot here. I mean, Erica essentially is the second boot version of Jessica DeBen. Someone that, again, was working with Jessica DeBen, was also in the same alliance as Jessica DeBen from before the tribes were formed. But then also, like Jessica DeBen, gets put on a tribe where she's in the minority, and through that gets kind of screwed over. Now, I will say, in comparison to Jessica DeBen, I don't think she was as screwed, in the sense that Jessica only had one day after her tribe came together to save herself. Obviously, Erica has more than that. Obviously, Erica gets voted out in the second round of the game, but she's still in a position where she is inherently disadvantaged, with her kind of being an easy person to take out after the Jessica vote. Also, I mean, obviously, she does survive a vote on this season, but again, she was also on the bottom for that vote, where she did not want Jessica to go home. And in essence, again, like, I think Erica is kind of this weird player here where, again, she had enough leeway to where she could have saved herself, to where, like, I'm not saying she's entirely screwed, because then she had a few days. She could have potentially formed a new majority. She could have also, even then, like, put the target on someone that was, again, at least weaker in challenges or something, where, again, she was probably one of the better female competitors on her tribe. I think she had a lot more potential that she kind of squandered, but in a way, again, she is still, like, quote unquote swap screwed, with her tribe formation just being a very bad one for her, to where, again, for me, I think that is enough to put her in this, like, screwed category, putting her number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to another player I think got very unfortunate with how exactly her game played out, and does actually come very close to staying, which is the main reason why she's so high on this list. And that person is Val Collins from Survivor San Juan del Sur. And again, I think Val is a player that gets very unfortunate on the offset. Again, she is someone that loses the duel to Jeremy, gets taken to Exile Island from the offset from the very beginning, to where, again, I think that definitely did harm her ability to gain social capital in the game. And I think that's something that put her on the bottom instantly, to where, while she's not the first boot of her tribe, she's someone that is largely expendable, is not even looped in on the plan there when Nadia goes home, only proceed to be this easy target for the following round. Though, despite that, again, I think she actually comes relatively close to staying. Now, again, I think her overall lie about having 2 idols is very sloppy and should not have worked, but it almost did. Kind of to her detriment, funnily, to where, again, convinced John Rocker to want her to stay because she had these idols that they could utilize together, but also it convinced him that she was going to play an idol. So why fight hard to keep the votes off of her when, again, she's going to have the idol anyway. So again, it's kind of this funny dichotomy there. But also, again, we do see Josh flip his vote at the last second to save Baylor as well. Though, again, she almost had the votes to take Baylor out of the game, but Josh kind of stops that at the last second to where, again, I think there's a lot of rockiness here of Val. I think Val, again, considering the very unfortunate position she was put in the very beginning of her being isolated from her tribe, I think she actually puts in some good work during her boot round where, again, she gets John Rocker on her side. She almost survives through putting her vote on Baylor to where Baylor almost gets sniped out of the game, though she also got kind of fortunate in the fact that Jeremy went to exile with John. That allowed them to build a connection. That got John to fight for her, but still, I do think she plays pretty well and got very unlucky in certain other aspects. So at the end of the day, I did put Val here number 12. Now number 11, and this is where we're getting a bit rocky this list, where straight up, I did not know what to do with this person. I think this person ends up being very difficult for me to assess because I think there's an argument that they should be lower on this list. So I think in general, there's just so many unknowns with this player that made me put them higher. I do have Jessie Camacho from Survivor Africa. And Jessie's this player, again, like the likes of Ashley Mazzaro. Jessie Camacho was sick. And I think that very much tampered her overall game. I think a major reason why she gets voted out, obviously, is because she's sick and people wanted to vote her out because she's a physical liability. To where, again, a lot of the question here becomes, how well would she have done if she was not sick? And I think there's so many unknowns there. Again, unlike the likes of Ashley, where, again, I don't think she was making it that deep even if she wasn't sick. Jessica Camacho, I'm more unsure. I really don't know. I do feel like there's definitely potential. She is still the second boot. Where, I mean, even looking at how the tribe is laid out, I don't think she's particularly well set up there. I don't know who she really has these really close connections to. But also, again, she definitely would have had Clarence as someone that would have been a potential boot. I do think it's very likely, actually. They probably do vote out Clarence had she not been sick. As again, they were very upset at Clarence. And while they, again, still talked about needing him for physical strength, I think that is a spot where they would have been willing to let him go had Jessie not been sick. But the question is, where she go from there? And to be honest, again, I don't know. And I feel like that is a big thing here, where I feel like if I did know and knew that she had this good backing around her, I would feel a lot more solid about this placement here. Yeah, as it stands right now, I feel like this is a little bit rocky. I really just didn't know where to put her. Now, again, next person we'll be talking about was in a similar case. Yeah, I feel more solid about that person, where Jessie, again, is also in this spot where, again, she was sick, she was voted out because of that, but I don't know where her game goes outside that. And to me, it was I had to either attach her to the next person we'll be talking about or attach her to the likes of an Ashley. Yeah, I feel like she's better than Ashley. I just feel like she would have had more potential in the game. But again, to be fair, I don't fully know. And I think that's what makes this placement overall a bit strange. And I could definitely see the argument that she should be lower on this list. Yeah, I think for the sake of this list and how I rank things, I think the fact that there are so many unknowns, and I feel like the fact that I feel a little bit more confident she would have survived the second round had it not been for the fact that she was sick, I think is enough to put her here at number 11. Now, number 10, same thing. Someone that was sick got voted out because they're sick. But again, I feel more confident about this player. We do have Tanya Vance from Survivor Thailand. And again, Tanya, I think, was very much voted out because she was sick. Where, again, she was sick from the very beginning. Despite that, she actually survives over a John Raymond. Mind you, again, that's a lot of anti-John Raymond stuff, but again, still, I think that is good for Tanya that she was voted out over probably one of the strongest men on their tribe. So again, that is something. Beyond that, I think Tanya's actually a really good social player. People actually very much liked her, even in the spot where she's voted out. Gandia still votes with her. And beyond that, again, she seemed to have very good connections on the tribe. And even John Raymond, who goes home first, supposedly was very close to her. I believe the story is also that Tanya had a very close relationship with Brian Heidick, and she was one of the only people that Brian Heidick actually kind of liked on the island. So again, that's something. Again, I do think had she not been sick, I think she would have had potential to go deeper into the game. Now, again, at the end of the day, I don't know her true potential in the game, considering obviously Brian Heidick has such a stranglehold on the game. I would not be shocked if she just turns into another follower for Brian. But again, I do think she was poised to make it much deeper into the game. I don't think she would have been the second boot for sure on that season had she not been sick. I don't think there would have been a reason to vote her out second. To where, again, I think there are definitely some big pros here. I just think at the end of the day, though, it is still a bit unknown on her overall game ability. But I do think the fact that she seemed to be very good socially is what does leave her here number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to probably one of the most forgotten about second boots, as evidenced by Brandon Donlin forgetting this person existed, but also I think probably one of the more screwed over second boots in the history of the show. And here we do have Melinda Hyder from Survivor Panama. And again, I think Melinda is actually understandably one of the more screwed over second boots in the history of the show. I think she's someone that, again, gets swap screwed as a second boot. Now, again, not necessarily, because again, obviously, like in terms of these tribes, it was 4 tribes into 2. There wasn't really this inherent majority group that forms right away. However, I do think she's in a spot where, again, she was in a very good spot on her original starting tribe. She was in the swing position on that tribe alongside Ruth Marie. They vote out Tina. Again, being one of the few people of the second boot grouping that actually had control over the first vote of the season. But then again, when she swaps, I think she gets put in a very unfortunate position. At that point, she, again, is one of the weaker members of her tribe. She's also from the older women, which had this stigma against her. And obviously, again, she's not Cirie. I think Cirie did a lot more good work in getting in people's good graces, where Melinda, again, wasn't that. And obviously, it's hard to do that. But again, I think she's still in a spot where she was in a very good spot before the swap. Well, obviously, those tribes were never going to stick together, but I think for her to go from a, again, top position on her original tribe to right on the bottom, I think it's definitely her getting very unlucky in the game. And even beyond that, again, there was some rockiness of the vote there. Again, Shane wanted to quit at a point. She potentially could have stayed due to that. But again, I think it's another person that I don't think Melinda does much wrong here. I don't think she does anything actively wrong. I think she just was put in a bad position by how the swap played out and how the younger players kind of just grouped together to take out the older women, to where, again, I don't think Melinda does much wrong. Now, obviously, again, ideally, she would be a more active player, and through that, probably could be higher on this list. Yeah, I think she is definitely someone that gets a bit screwed over. So, again, she's here at number 9. And now number 8, also another one of the more understatedly screwed over players. I think part of this is because even at the time, I said this person was a pretty bad player, and I do think they're a pretty bad player. I think they actively sabotaged their own games at points. Some of their gameplay was a bit questionable in their season, but they get a bit screwed over. And at number 7, I do have Justine Brennan from Survivor 43. Which I believe is the top second boot of the new era. So that's something. But again, I think Justine is kind of forgotten about in the fact that Justine actually had half the tribe on her side, where by the time she gets voted out, she obviously had a really close relationship with Noelle. She also had a really close relationship with Dwight. So again, those 3 were half of the tribe. Again, she would have been in a pretty decent position had not been for the fact that Dwight lost his vote. So at that point, they could have potentially caused a tie. Now, at the end of the day, I believe the plan from them was still to actually split the vote 2-2, where in that case, obviously, Jessie probably still flips. It's a 3-2-1. She probably goes home anyway. But that means she gets taken on the 3-2-1. She gets taken on the plurality vote, where she still does have half the tribe on her side. But without that, obviously, it makes it more likely that Jessie just outright flips, because obviously he just can and vote her out in that spot. And to her, again, I think she does bad work with Jessie. I do think her telling Jessie that she doesn't trust them is really stupid. And that's why I think, like, at the end of the day, I think she actually plays worse than really a lot of the people we just talked about. I think, like, when we're talking about, like, actively bad play, I think at least goes down to, like, Patricia as the last person that played actively worse than her. But despite that, again, she was still in a decent position, again, having a 3-person group locked. Jessie as a potential 4th, as, again, I don't think Jessie was going to go to a tiebreaker for her. And again, Cody had this vendetta against her because she was a saleswoman, which is really dumb in itself. To where, again, I do think Justine is actually kind of screwed over here. To her, well, again, she might have potentially gone home either way. But in that situation, it would have been, again, a wonky 3-2-1 vote. To where I do think Justine, again, for a second boot, ends up being one of the better ones on the board. And that's why she's here at number 8. And now number 7, and here we're moving on to a player that my opinion of them has actually changed pretty radically after my latest rewatch of their season. This being a player that actually on my initial draft of this list was like 20 spots lower. Yeah, actually having rewatched the season and recontextualizing their game, I do think they're one of the better second boots, even though there are some very wonky circumstances here. And at number 7, I do have Ashley Ashby from Survivor Palau, which if you were to tell me that Ashley Ashby would have been towards the top of my second boot ranking, I would have been pretty mind blown. Yeah, I do think Ashley's actually a player that in retrospect plays a pretty competent game for someone that was booted second. Again, she is a player that technically had the majority on her side at the time that she goes out, while also having survived a few eliminations by that point. Obviously, again, this is Survivor Palau, where we do have the Jonathan Wanda situation, which is something that, again, while I don't really factor that in as a proper vote, again, she still built relationships enough to not be instantly picked off there. She also then proceeded to survive over Jolanda at the first ever vote in a spot where it did look like Ashley was one of the bigger movers and shakers in that vote. Again, her, Stephanie, and Angie seemed to be a pretty powerful trio in the game at that point, to where, again, they had like connections to the likes of James, and she herself had a connection to Ibrahim, to where I actually do think Ashley was in a somewhat strong position coming into the following round. Though, again, she ultimately goes home in the second round in a spot where pretty much everyone ends up voting her out. Though, again, I think there's very strange circumstances around that, where the reason why she ends up being voted out there is essentially because she quits the game. And again, obviously, quitting the game is something that I think is a very tough thing to rationalize around gameplay and like how to rank it amongst other people that didn't play the game, where, again, I think it's a spot where, yes, it does show her not having this gusto to play the game, but it also ends up showing the fact that I think she would have survived had she wanted to in this round, which is better than you could say about these other people that wanted to stay and they just failed at doing so. Where again, Ashley in this spot gets taken out over Kim in a spot where Jeff Wilson was like really campaigning for Kim, and I do think Jeff Wilson definitely got some votes on his own to save Kim, but I do think a lot of the reason why Ashley goes home is again because she doesn't really fight back, where again she had these allies that were going to keep her safe. Again, she had Stephanie and Angie. She also had James as someone that was very anti-Kim. So again, that's enough to cause a tie. And again, there was talk about actually going to tie coming into this round. Yeah, again, they end up backing down because Ashley wants to quit. And even then, I don't think they actually would have gone to a tie. As we see in the actual vote itself, Ibrahim ends up putting a stray vote simply because, again, he was extremely close to Ashley. And again, she was the one to save him during the schoolyard pick. And through that, again, I think if they had just gone through with the plan and Ashley didn't want to quit the game, it would have been a 4-3-1 vote where Kim goes home. Now, again, beyond that, who knows? It's Oolong. He probably gets picked off along the way. But again, from the point that she was booted at, I do think she was actually in a pretty strong position, again, if she wanted to be there. And again, that is the big dilemma on how much you dock her for quitting the game in this spot. I do think on a second boot ranking in particular here, again, ranking her amongst the second boots in terms of how she played up to the point where she was booted, I think she plays pretty well up to that point outside of the people that had these massive targets in their backs coming into the season and a certain other person we're about to be talking about. So again, I do think Ashley is actually a pretty understated second boot. That's why she's here at number 7. Now number 6, actually the top non-returning player. I didn't mean for this to happen. It kind of accidentally happened where the top 5 are all the returning players that were second boots. At number 6, the top newbie second boot of all time is Vince Sly from Survivor Worlds Apart, which might catch people very much off guard, as I think most people look at Vince Sly as a joke. Again, he's this coconut vendor that seeks truth. He is this very wacky, zany character, but I also think he's a very understated player kind of in Survivor history. Now again, like at the end of the day, do I think he's the greatest player in the world? No. Obviously, again, he did not rub half of his tribe the right way. Again, Jen and Joe did not like him the slightest. Obviously, he didn't bond with Haley. And obviously, he gets taken out in his first ever tribal. However, he almost pulls off a really insane move. Where again, he almost pulls off a 3-2-1. Where again, he had the numbers set up for him, Nina, and Will to really upset the overall tribe power structure and pull off this pretty insane move. And obviously, again, it falls through. And normally, again, yeah, you would fault him for that. And this is the thing with, and that's the thing with Vince, is that I don't think he does that much wrong. Actually causes boo here. Where even in how he gets voted out in a 3-2-1, he wasn't even the target. The majority of the tribe wanted Nina out. He gets voted out because of a complete misunderstanding that he had nothing to do with. Or he gets voted out essentially because of Nina, where Nina tries to confirm the plan with Will, in which she accidentally ends up throwing Vince under the bus, to where because of that, Will starts to not trust Vince, leading to him flipping his vote and out of the blue voting out Vince in a 3-2-1 in a spot where, again, no one really wanted Vince out in this spot outside of Will, and Will is even acting on miscommunication, to where, again, I think Vince is understatedly one of the best second boots in the history of the show. I think he is someone that, again, almost pulls off this really insane move. Had it actually gone through, he would have been at the top of the power structure of his new tribe. And again, it all falls through just due to a complete misunderstanding in a spot where, again, I don't think Vince does much wrong. So again, I have Vince as the top newbie, second boot in the history of the show. He's here at number 6. Now, number 5. And again, as I said, top 5 are all the returning players that have been second boots in the history of the show. And again, there is merit to that. Obviously, I think as a returning player, you usually have a stigma against you. And I believe all but 2 of these players did have pretty big bullseyes on their backs coming into this season, which played a factor into that. And at number 5, we're probably coming to the person that probably had the least chance of doing anything on this season of these 5. And that person is Tony Velachos from Survivor Game Changers. And again, Tony's in this weird spot here where, again, I think he was probably the most screwed of these top 5 when coming into the game. Again, he is such a massive bullseye on the board where, again, him and Sandra were the 2 biggest targets by a lot coming into this season, where no one wanted to work with Tony. And the fact that he even survives a vote, again, he survives over Sierra, I think is pretty impressive in itself. Now, mind you, again, part of that's due to physical strength, but the fact that he starts off the season by running into the jungle, pretending like he's looking for an idol, is pretty insane, especially the fact that they don't proceed to vote him out immediately afterwards. However, obviously, the reason why he is lower than the next 4 is because I think he plays the worst actively of this group, where, again, I love Tony. I think Tony is, up to this point, the best player in Survivor history, particularly due to his 2 really dominant wins. However, his play on Game Changers is very sloppy. And again, you can credit that to the fact that he knew he had no shot coming into Game Changers, just wanted to have fun. But even then, he plays so sloppily, especially in the second round. Again, him starting this feud with Sandra is just very misguided. He ends up rubbing people like Troyzan the wrong way. He puts this big bullseye on his back to where the entire tribe flips on him. Again, all that, very bad. Again, I think Tony plays all that very poorly and puts himself in a position where, again, had he just remained calm, I think he should have had an easy ride for the next couple rounds. I mean, at least like Aubrey should have been voted out over him. I mean, to be fair, again, like how much ground does he really have to work with following that? I think at the end of the day, he was kind of screwed no matter what. But again, he had no reason to actually be the second boot outside of his own actions. I think he fully puts that on himself. But again, it's also still a spot where, again, he had no shot coming into the season. So again, it is this tough dichotomy there. I think at the end of the day, again, I'm still going to take into account the fact that he had no shot because of pregame notions, but still, I do think he plays the worst of this top 5. So that's why he's here at number 5. Now, number 4. Similar thing. I don't think this person plays particularly great, but also was kind of screwed coming into the season. That person is Stephanie LaGrossa from Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. And again, Stephanie is in this spot here where on the Heroes tribe, she's kind of screwed. Obviously, she has Tom as a really solid ally, but outside of that, she doesn't really have many connections with many of the other players. A lot of the other players had pretty strong pregame relationships. Obviously, you have Sri and Amanda who are working together from Micronesia. You had Amanda who was close to Courtney, who's dating Steven, who was close to JT, to where, again, they kind of had a grouping there. Again, there was a lot of pre-gaming going on at the Heroes side of things. That Stephanie was just kind of left on the outside, mixing out the fact that also her and Rupert had some beef from preseason because Rupert was always kind of jealous of Stephanie being the new hotness immediately after him. And also, again, obviously we have this feud between her and James, which, to be fair, isn't particularly great play. I do think her fighting back with James, again, is not a great spot to be in, but again, she was kind of screwed to begin with. And that's kind of the thing with Stephanie. It's like, I think she was kind of screwed on her tribe. I mean, again, after Sugar, I think she was the most obvious person to go at that point. She just simply did not have numbers. She only had Tom and Colby. And again, I do think a lot of that's based around pregame. I don't think she really had much room to maneuver, but also I don't think she plays it particularly well either. Again, I think she should have probably done more during the first round of, again, pulling over Sugar, pulling in Candace, trying to organize a flip against this pregame group. But again, I still think that's a bit of a tough sell for her in the position she was at the beginning of the game. Where, again, I think at the end of the day, again, I don't think she had much room to maneuver in this game. And I think she was very much screwed preseason. But again, I still don't think she plays the greatest, which is why she's not higher on the list. But I do think she, again, plays more optimally than Tony. So that's enough to be here at number 4. Now, number 3. And this is kind of a weird spot on the list at this point where the top 3 here come down to the 2 people who I think probably had the lesser targets on their backs of these returning players that came back, but also probably had the most control during the first vote of their seasons. While there's another person that was easily the most screwed of these people so far, but also played the most passive of the group. So again, it was a decision on where to go. At number 3, I am going with the person who I think was the most screwed. That player is Amber Mariano from Survivor Winners at War. And Amber obviously was pretty screwed on Winners at War. I don't think she really had much of a chance to save herself. Obviously, she was coming in with her husband on the opposite tribe, to where obviously she had a big bullseye on her back because of that. And again, I think there's also, again, the relationship between Rob and Sandra kind of deteriorated, not really doing anything she necessarily did, largely because like her and Rob decided to do the season at the last second. And again, to be fair, they could have told Sandra this and maybe that would have repaired the relationship, but still, I mean, like, Sandra had a vendetta against Rob coming into the season, and I think she takes it out on Amber in this spot. Also beyond that, I don't think Amber does anything actively right either. It's not like Amber did much to save herself. I think she was just kind of obvious first boots, and even though, again, people like Kim, people like Tyson wanted to work with her, it simply was never going to actually happen here. And again, just in general, I don't think Amber really had much going for her on this season, but again, it's kind of like a double-sided thing. It's like, how much going for her, because again, she had massive bullseye on her back that was pretty inescapable, considering the overall tribe dynamics, to where I think it would have been very difficult for her to even conjure this group to not vote for her. I think it probably would have necessitated her trying to put this bullseye on the Game Changers grouping, but even then, I do think the people in the middle want to keep that grouping around as big shields for later. I think Amber was in a pretty unwinnable position, considering, like, of the people in her group, she was very clearly the person that you were going to target because of her connection to Boston Rob. But again, I don't think she does that much right while in the game either. So it's like, again, it's double-edged sword. I decided to go with the people that I think do more right as people to be above her on this list, even though, again, I think she was definitely the most screwed of the people in this top 5 outside of Tony. But again, I think it is still her very passive play that leaves her here at number 3. Now, number 2. Top 2 of the list. A very difficult top 2, where number 2 person here actually was my number 1 on my initial draft. I did think about it for a bit more, and I did drop them a spot simply because I think the number 1 person had other circumstances affecting their game, where I think, again, this person's boot was mostly on them. You know, there are some major pros to their game as well. At number 2, we do have Shireen Ascui from Survivor Cambodia. And again, Shireen leads the charge on the Vetus vote. Again, as I mentioned before, it is very rare for a second boot to be a person in a dominant position during the first round and actually leading the charge in the vote. And again, Shireen is that. She is one of less than a handful of people that actually had full control over the first vote of their season, where, again, she is very much this person putting this bullseye on Vetus's back. And obviously, like, Varner and PG were like these swing votes aside towards them. But again, she was very much leading this vote alongside Spencer. Now, I think that's impressive play. The issue, I don't think she placed her second round particularly well. Obviously, like, by that point, and Varner flips back. Varner was always going to flick back, though. Again, I think that was his pregame strategy, was to side the new schoolers initially, then flip back to the old schoolers and kind of go back and forth to deteriorate both sides. Again, I think this is always what he was going to do. So I don't necessarily fault Shireen for that. However, I do fault her for her management of her relationship with Abby Maria. I think she very much mismanages Abby Maria after, again, she saved Abby Maria in the first vote. And the fact that she wasn't able to get Abby Maria to be loyal to her, I think is definitely a detriment there. Also, you could say, again, it's an issue that she was voted out over Spencer, where obviously Spencer is, again, the bigger physical competitor. You might want him around for challenges, though long term, I do think Spencer's definitely the bigger threat on the board, and definitely someone that had a bigger reputation coming in the season, where, again, as I mentioned before, I think Shireen did not have that much of a target coming into this season, to where, again, she was not looked at as this particularly great player. I mean, she did just come off of Worlds Apart, but was kind of on the bottom the entire time, really. I mean, I think her move to take out Vias is probably the most impressive individual move she across her entire Survivor run. So, I think when assessing this top 5, definitely one of the people that had the cleanest games coming into this, where it's not as much tainted by pregame stigma, though at the same time, it is still tainted by pregame, where obviously, like, a lot of the reason why she's flipped on immediately afterwards is because of pregame. I mean, it is the fact that Varner had these pregame connections to the old school players that allows him to flip back and flip the vote onto her. Though, to be fair, it's also pregame that allows her to control that Vitas vote to begin with, where it's because she had this pregame relationship with Varner and has him siding with her to begin with. So again, it's kind of just double-edged sword. Again, I think it's a bit of a weird game to assess. Though again, I think of any of the second boots in the history of the show, I think Shireen is probably the person that has the most influence over the first vote of their season, where she came into the season with this big vendetta against Vitas and actually gets him to be the first boot of the season. That is something. But the reason why she's not number 1 on this list, though, is because I do think there are still some things she mismanages along the way, where I feel like the number 1 person, as we'll talk about, is a little bit absolved of the things that ended his game. So because of that, for me, I do have Shireen here number 2. Now number 1. Number 1, second boot in the history of Survivor US is Rudy Bosch from Survivor All-Stars. And again, it's a weird one. I think Rudy is just a very tough player to assess here, as, again, I think in ways you can argue he should be lower on the list, lower to the people that were, like, again, sick or physically weak, and Rudy shouldn't be this high because of that. As, again, at the end of the day, Rudy was simply voted out because he was old. That's really the main reason. I mean, the fact that he was not able to keep up in challenges, he was voted out because, he was on a smaller tribe. They needed physical strength. They needed to vote him out. That is really the main reason he was voted out. Outside of that, I think Rudy actually plays All-Stars pretty well. And to be fair, again, he came into the season with not much of a target on his back. I think actually people wanted to actively work with him. No one really looked at him as this big strategic player. Obviously, people liked Rudy. And again, I think he came into the season with a very good reputation. Again, I think had he not been old, I think he actually would have been pretty primed for a very deep run the game, potentially even winning the game by the end. As again, I think he sets himself up well pretty much from the beginning. Again, right away, we see him be right in the middle alongside Rupert. Again, we see him approach Rupert to start an alliance. They are actively working together at the very beginning of the game. Rupert sticks by him when getting voted out. To be fair, I think that's more so Rupert trying to manage his perception, but still, again, had he not been old, I do think Ethan goes out second. Where, again, had Rudy just played the game, like, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years earlier, I think he potentially is the winner of Survivor All-Stars. Where, again, I also don't think he does anything wrong. Again, like, outside just him not being able to keep up in challenges, there's no really any other incentive to voting him out. People were sobbing when voting him out. They didn't want to vote him out. Even Rupert really struggled with the idea of even letting him go. So again, I think Rudy is probably the second boot that had the most potential within their season, to where even in this spot, where had he not been voted out in this spot, had they decided to not vote out based on physical strength, and had he been able to get to the swap, I think Rudy's set. Again, if Rudy had taken Ethan's spot on Mogo Mogo, I think he's set for a while. I don't think anyone's targeting Rudy, especially over, again, Hatch, over Colby. He probably finds himself in a tough spot after that. But still, it's like, I think he has a deep run in the game at that point. And again, who knows what he's able to do with his position following that. And even then, that's assuming he goes on Mogo Mogo. If he ends up on Shapira, he still has Rupert there. I can see him building other connections there as well. I can see him building a bond with, like, Big Tom and potentially be dragged along by Buster Rob. I think he does have a lot of legs in that game. Again, had he somehow stumbled his way to the end, I think he's very likely to win that season. And obviously all of that is just speculative. But at the end of the day, it's like, again, I do feel the best about Rudy's position in the game at that current point than any of the other second boots on the board. I think he largely gets voted out just simply because they needed physical strength, which, if that is your only flaw in the game, especially in a season like All-Stars, where I think you could much more assume how things are going to play out because you know how these other people play, and we kind of knew where the dynamics land. Again, I feel like Rudy is the second boot here that I think gets the most screwed due to things like kind of outside of their control, to where I think Rudy is the best second boot in the history of Survivor US. So again, he's here at number 1. There we go. That is my second boot ranking for Survivor US. Will I continue this with other shows? Maybe. We'll see. Beyond that, also, obviously still going to continue to do big rankings here and there. I mean, next year, I guess I'm doing my anti-penultimate juror ranking. For anyone excited about that. And beyond that, obviously, you got Survivor 50 nearing. Obviously, I'll be doing a lot of coverage of that. Obviously, Survivor 48 is coming up. I'll do coverage of that. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.